Okay, I think the general story people hear about racism is that it's always been with us. It's part of human nature, and it's something that you really can't be changed. Some people say it's always been there. It's just natural. Other people say, well, it used to fit in the past as an idea. People lived in tribes and they all hated each other. But slowly, as we've got through the Enlightenment, we've got to a stage where in Britain it's just a series of old-fashioned ideas that don't count anymore. And they're ideas that can slowly be driven away by modern progressive thinkers. And I think that you sort of see strange mixtures of these things. I mean, I hope not to bring this up in every meeting I go to, but I've been reading a new book by the editor of Prospect magazine and the head of the Demos think tank, who's a sort of right-wing Labour theoretician, who has views about how racism has worked. I mean, for instance, for people in this room, something about fighting Powellism. He says, for instance, Powellism in the 60s and 70s never developed into a British equivalent of the French National Front. That was partly because of the first-past-the-post electoral system, and partly because British common sense is generally hostile to anything associated with extremism. You have an idea about British common sense which can challenge racism there, but also a thing that says that you should not have allowed mass immigration from the global south, and that it would have been better to get workers from Ireland. He says Britain did not need more work. Britain did need more workers in the 50s and 60s, but they could have come from across the Irish Sea rather than from distant cultures on the other side of the globe, especially as the imperial connection that brought them to Britain was soon to become a source of guilt to the coloniser and resentment to the colonised. Now, this is a book that's been published this year, this spring, and it's a very mainstream book. And the reason I mention it is because of that attitude. It's an attitude that's divorced from history. Racism may be something now, exists now. It may have some connection, he admits there, something to do with the empire, but let's not talk about that. It's something that we'd be better off without having people here who came from places in the empire. Now, I want to say that racism we have now is directly connected to the development of empire, to the development of capitalism, and actually it's not something that always existed. It's not something which is something inherently in human nature, or particularly to particular nations. I do like the idea of the British being less racist than other people that book suggested. And what I want to start with is I think that it requires a Marxist argument to understand how racism developed, which talks about how it came out of the changing ideas about people and changing ideas that came with the development of capitalism. I'll come back in later on in the talk to talk a bit about prejudice before the development of capitalism, because I'm certainly not saying that there was no prejudice in the world or no one was oppressed before the development of capitalism. But what I want to talk about is how you shift from various ideas, various sorts of prejudice, to something called racism. I think you need to start by saying, what is racism? Which is an idea of having a people, Peter Alexander once put it, discrimination against a group on grounds of some imputed inherited characteristics, such as colour. The idea that people have something they can't get rid of, something that's inherent to them, which makes them inferior to other people. Now, the advantage of all the human characteristics that you could think of, there's an enormous advantage in Europe to people who have black skins because you can spot them. I mean, I think you don't want to make too crude about this, but this is one of the reasons that that racism is easy to develop. If you can easily identify a group and say they're the ones, they're different. I mean, it can work with people who have different clothes or different culture, and I think that there's sometimes people say it's different if it's about culture rather than the way people look. Well, I think that's not true. But I'll come back to that. Come back to that again. What I want to start with is to say that racism comes very specifically, as we understand it now, from a specific period. There's a reason why I've got a picture on the first slide here of a slave ship. This is black Africans jammed into the hold of a slave ship for the transport, the terrible middle passage across the Atlantic to work on slave plantations in the Americas. if you look at the history of racism, it's entirely tied up to the slave trade. And I think that there's a problem with this. People will say, well, it wasn't the first, the British involvement in the Atlantic slave trade and other European powers' involvement was certainly not the first existence of a slave society. It was not the first time when some people have been brutalised or worked to death. So why do I say that it makes such a difference? I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One is the scale, which again I'll come back to, and the other is the fact that it comes along with the development of capitalist society. Capitalist society actually shifts the way that people think about the world, because I haven't really got time to talk about it much, but the idea of the market suggests that you have a degree of equality between the buyer and seller who are able to work out a fair exchange. You get all these sort of ideas of the free market developing, the idea that you have a level playing field and fair exchange. These are ideas which may seem so obvious at the moment, that the idea that they were completely new and hadn't been developed until 400 or 500 years ago may seem unusual. But I think this is one of the things about the whole way that when you're discussing racism, you get ideas about things which seem natural or obvious now to a large section of the population, but actually are relatively new developments in terms of historical ideas. As you get the idea of the development of capitalism, of this idea of markets with people being more or less equal and having to work out how they exchange things on a market between each other through negotiations, through shifting ideas in between themselves, you get an idea of how people should develop. It's no coincidence that with the first bourgeois revolutions, the first times when you get people demanding that you have market relations and capitalism running society, the famous ones, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, slightly earlier, the English Revolution, where people get rid of the old hierarchical feudal societies and say, we're going to have a different sort of society. On what basis is this different society going to come on? I put up some things here, that the American famous Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's a philosophical point, but it's also a practical market point in terms of how capitalist relations will work with each other. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are the rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. 1776 in America. Similar time in France you have, won't try a French accent, I'll just do the translation, liberty, equality and brotherhood as the main slogan of the revolution. So at this point, you're seeing the development of a series of ideas that people are basically equal, and within that equality, you will use your own worth. You know, the idea of the self-made man, that you can invest, you can, through your own skill, shift your position in society. The basic myths of our modern society. Now, the money that built this society, that started building America and so on, came, as I mentioned before, from the Atlantic slave trade, which is the triangular slave trade. There's a map here. Basically, manufactured goods from Europe would be taken to the coast of usually West Africa, where they would be sold and traded for slaves. The slaves would then be shipped across the Middle Passage to the Americas, where they would be sold to be worked, often worked to death on plantations. And the stuff that was produced on the plantations, cotton, tobacco, what's the other one, sugar, would then be taken back to Europe and sold. This was an unusually profitable thing. It's rare for a trader to be able to have some rich product on each part of the trading journey they're going on. It made enormous amounts of money for various governments. Not for various governments, for various traders and the governments who they paid taxes to. It is worth saying that this isn't a trade that was particularly invented by the British, but that the Portuguese and the Spanish, who started doing it first, sort of fell behind, because the British had a new capitalist sort of government that favoured merchants and favoured people, and meant that they I'm not going to go into it. I'm sure there's other meetings on the developments of early capitalism, but it meant that they could keep the money, they could keep investing, and actually they used the money to invest in building cities we will have heard of: Bristol, Liverpool. London was already a big city, but it built more on this. The money from the slave trade was used to actually start building the capitalist industrial state that we know now. But that's, in a way, by the by to this this thing. The thing that's interesting to me is the contradiction between the idea of a sort of equality that's going on and the idea that the money that's funding it is coming from a trade in human beings, a trade in people who presumably should have their own rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, though they're not getting a whole lot of it. Now, when the Americas were first discovered by Europeans, and the idea that you could set up plantations and grow things that were useful to ship back to Europe developed, you needed people to work the plantations. The first people who had to work the plantations were the Native Americans, the people who were there already, who were captured, who were then worked into the ground. Now, there's various reasons why there were problems with the using Native American labour. One is the number of them who died, partly from but European diseases. But there's also an issue with people were then used other sorts of unfree labour. There was a thing of the indentured labour, which is where you would take someone, usually in British case an Irish person, but sometimes a poor British person who'd been captured or sentenced for some crime. You would say, you will go across there, you will work without wages, without any kind of real recompense except your food for, let's say, 10 years, and at the end of that you'll be a free person. This has two advantages for the traders and the government. Firstly, you get rid of someone you don't want, that you have someone to work on the plantation. Secondly, at the end of the work, if they're still alive, and a lot of them weren't still alive because there was no particular incentive not to work people to death if you knew that you were going to lose them as a resource at the end of the time. At the end of this time, you would have someone else there who could do more work because they'd have little choice but to keep on working in these lands. This worked to some extent, but a lot of people died because they weren't used to the climate and doing hard labour in a tropical climate. A lot of people escaped, and here's the thing about the advantage of going for people with black skins. If you escape and then mingle in with the rest of the population, you're hard to spot, and if they say you were a slave, and they say no, I wasn't, not me, you can't really, it's very much harder to say than if you've said everyone with a black skin must be a slave. And so I think that's a beginning of understanding of why it was that black people were used. And in fact, the Eric Williams, who did one of the first great studies on the connection between slavery and racism, said, here is the origin of Negro slavery, that the reason was economic, not racial. So you start from the fact that you had a source of slaves. The slave trade existed there to some extent, but already on the coast and taking some people across to America. So you thought, this is something that can really work. This is something which can give a source of people who are able to work in tropical heat, and also people who we can spot and identify and say are something different. And so they were superior for that reason. And that meant that you then start working out justifications, remembering back to what I've said about the ideas of equality that are emerging at the same time. None of these things happens overnight, they happen over time. The ideas of equality start emerging and come as time goes by. The ideas of black inferiority start emerging and emerge as time goes by. And in terms of Britain is coming to become the big power in terms of the slave trade. It's something, sometimes you get the idea that Britain's main involvement in the slave trade was in having ships that went around raiding other people who were selling slaves. That's a minor thing that happens later on. For most of the period of the slave trade, Britain is top power, who is going around buying and selling slaves and sending people across the Atlantic to live in misery. And partly because that meant that, relatively speaking, there were relatively few black people in Britain, because if you think of the triangular trade, the mass of black people don't have to come to Britain, they just go between Africa and the Americas. But there were lots of black people in the bits that were owned by Britain, particularly the Caribbean islands, and the planters who made their money and became very rich there were the first people to start seriously arguing that there's something different about black people, that black people are inherently inferior. And they take it to the furthest extreme, the idea of how inferior black people are. They also have to justify the most terrible things. I want to just briefly say something about the Middle Passage and the travelling across the Atlantic and what it meant. And I want to give an example that came to court, which is the example of a ship called the Zong, which was travelling across the Atlantic, taking slaves. It had a crew of 17 and 470 slaves on board. We know about all this because it came to a court case in London. 60 of the slaves had died and more were ill. The captain was worried that they would lose the value of their cargo, the slaves, if they arrived with so many ill. So he thought, what if we were to say that there was an emergency on board ship and we had no choice but to lose the slaves? Say we ran out of water. So what he said to the crew, this is what we're going to say. They took the slaves, all chained together, chucked them overboard. And then did basically an insurance scam. No, our cargo, remember the slaves were the cargo. Our cargo, we had to throw it overboard in order to save the crew. Now, why this came to court, incidentally, was because they were saying, getting them on the insurance scam. You've been fiddling your insurance. And that, I'm only mentioning this to say how it is, the kind of mindset you have to get into in order to treat people like this. And this is how you can start getting to the mindset where the official history of Jamaica, written by a guy called Edward Long in 1774, can say an attitude to black people. This is an attitude which has not been seen before. And I apologise for putting this up, but I think you need to see how far these things go. And it says, when we reflect on the nature of these men and their dissimilarity from the rest of mankind, must we not conclude that they are a different species of the same genus? That the orangutan and some races of black men are very nearly allied is, I think, more than probable. And then he goes on to talk about the hideous sexual practices of black people, which for some reason is something racists always feel the need to slip into fairly quickly. But I think the interesting thing about this disgusting passage is it's modernism. It's not harking back to ancient myths. It's not harking back to things. It's talking about new scientific methods. It's talking about new ways, taxonomy, the new way they're dividing up and talking about genus and species and so on. It's saying we've developed a new scientific way of understanding humanity which people didn't understand before, and this proves that, amazingly enough, we are superior and they are very much inferior. And indeed, they are really animals, which is how you could chuck a load of people overboard, all this sort of thing. And to start with, this kind of view is very much something that's out there with planters. But once these people come back to Britain, they bring their money, they pay for MPs. I mean, these are the real richest, like the oil barons of their time. And it's not surprising that their ideas start spreading through society. And I should say, as with most racist ideas, and this is something that will people should keep thinking about again and again, they tend to start from the top and work down. The liberal society always likes to say racist ideas start from the bottom and work up. It's just not true, and for a long time it was the case that the ruling class were incredibly racist and were very worried about the fact that when slaves, for instance, would arrive in Britain and escape, the mob, as they put it, would help them. And this was something that was particularly shocking. But I do think it's worth saying, because I mentioned the Enlightenment and how the Enlightenment was seen as a way of getting rid of racism, that it was actually, this is the period of the Enlightenment, it's also the period when scientific racism, or racism as we understand it now, is emerging and it's developing. And I want to quote David Hume, the great Enlightenment philosophers, who said in 1753, so it's even earlier than this passage, I am apt to suspect that Negroes, and in general all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, That's interesting because you're starting to see the development of more advanced racism that I'll come into later, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any complexion other than white. What the Egyptians were doing, I don't know, but let's go to sort of thing, or the Chinese. Oh, anyway, this is what he was saying at this point. There never was a civilized nation of any complexion other than white, nor even any individual eminent, either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacture amongst them, no arts, no sciences. You say, hang on, but this is leading intellectual of his day. This is not the guy, Edward Long. You can say, well, he was some planter out in the islands, but David Hume was not. So racism has become mainstream in terms of the ruling class in Britain. And this is at a time when you start seeing black people arriving in Britain. And so it becomes harder. This is Olende Equiano, who was someone who wrote a novel, a narrative, a story about his life. He was born in West Africa, he was captured, he went along the Middle Passage and had a whole series of remarkable adventures, oh my God, in his life, and ended up as part of the anti-slavery campaign. It's well worth reading his book if you get the chance. In Britain. But when this guy is going about having written an erudite book, touring around doing speaking tours in Britain, it makes it harder for the likes of that kind of really brutal racism to make sense. But it did catch on, as I said, with the ruling class, because it made sense in terms of what they believed. And I'll try, if I get time, to do a little bit on that. But I do want to go back to the idea. Because it's that racism didn't exist before capitalism, because I think it's something which is so against the mainstream ideas that it is worth mentioning some things, and I want to go back. It's a favourite thing, so people may have seen this before. This is Septimius Severus, who was a Roman emperor. Now he was, in modern terms, what you would call Berber. He came from North Africa. But the Roman Empire, once they conquered the area around the Mediterranean, they saw themselves as a Mediterranean empire, which meant that people from North Africa, like the Berbers, were part of it, and people from north of Italy, like the English, were not. So civilized people like this guy, Septimius Severus, could become emperor. It was a lot dodgier that you'd get some barbarians from strange islands in the north becoming emperor, and I think that the idea that there's still disputes about exactly what the racial background of people were, which I think says something in itself. It's not the case that someone said, "Blimey, we've got an emperor and he's a Berber." No one actually commented on the fact because he was just the emperor. And it's interesting. I mean, there's also, you could go on at great length about people who were stationed in Britain, like the Moorish battalions that came and were stationed, who were definitely black, who were part of the occupying force that was keeping people here down. So the idea, I haven't really got time to go through these things in any depth. I just want to give an idea of what life was like before there was an idea that people were divided by racial colours. And I want to do this partly because it's one of my favourite pictures, but I want to go on to the ideas that we can come after the Roman Empire to Britain and Europe in the medieval period, when there was a lot of ignorance and prejudice about different sorts of people. Now, this is a book that was published, I've lost my place in the notes, so I can't remember the date, but in the, actually I've got my note on screen, in 1544, it's a German book about peoples of the world, which gets together stories that have been heard about different sorts of people that you might meet if you travelled to far places, and these are examples of the different sorts of people that you might come across. The point of this is that you might say some strange things, Africans have these characteristics or those characteristics, but on the whole, people far away were a bit strange and we didn't know all that much about them. And when people did meet them, they had all sorts of different questions and things to say about them. Now, there is something to say about European attitudes to black people, because it comes up a lot, this is a picture from the 1400s. It's an embroidery that shows a black man scourging Christ. Now, The reason for showing it is because there's no particular idea in the Bible of Christ being white and anyone who scourged him being black. But in medieval iconography and imagery, there was often an idea of devils being dark. So there was occasionally this idea that people who are dark are probably a bit evil. Now, does this mean that there was racism as we understand it? I would argue that things are very contradictory, but no, it doesn't. This is St. Maurice, or Saint Moritz, as he's also known, who was portrayed as black. This is, again, from Germany. It's a statue in Magdeburg Cathedral. So it was, while there could be negative connotations to being black, there could also be just some people are black. There wasn't anything consistent. So what came up with the slave trade, with the trade and the fight that came there, was an idea that something was different. Now, if you saw a black person, you could tell that they were inferior. You could tell that they were someone who was inherently different. I was going to say a bit about slavery, but before the Atlantic Slave, but I'm not going to because I'm running out of time. So perhaps if people are interested in that, we could bring it up in the discussion. And I want to just briefly say about what this meant in practice in terms of ideas shifting, because the historian Brian Kelly has looked at the development of, my pronunciation's awful, but I think it's Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, which was at the time owned by the British. And at the beginning of the 17th century, you saw plantations where you had staff on them who would be made up sometimes of European indentured people, sometimes of Native Americans, sometimes of black people. And in the commentaries that are written at the time about who owns what and things, sometimes they'll be referred to as servants, sometimes they'll be referred to as slaves, and it's all a bit mixed together and confusing. There's even a thing where planters were worried about mixed marriages. It wasn't that they were worried about marriages between people who were white and people who were black. What they were worried about was marriages between people who were owned and people who were free. And so you see an idea, because it was about property relations, the main thing was about property. And I said it's advantageous if you're talking about owning one sort of people, if you can identify them easily. But this is something that happens in a process over 100 years. Indeed, until 1670, it was possible for black people to be free, some of them were, to be rich, to own other people, and there was a shift where the governing people had to say, actually we want to change this. This is becoming a problem. So that you see that by 100 years later, ideas have changed. I would like to say more about this, but I'd recommend that you read the chapter in the book where I can do it at greater length. But because it's the whole point I'm trying to make is that ideas change, that none of these things are fixed, that the relationships between people actually can change very quickly, which is why it's possible for in the late 18th century to have British people, white people arguing for the abolition of slavery, to have the whole campaign that came up in Britain against the slave trade being pushed partly by people like Toussaint Louverture and the slave revolts in the Caribbean, but partly by people in the emerging cities, the artisans and poor people in the emerging cities of what would become the industrial north, particularly, writing petitions saying we're not prepared to work with the slave trade, we want to identify with the slaves. And of course there is an element to which these are people who are being driven into factories, and the factories are places where you will be worked to death. That people say, oh, slavery is horrible and factories are horrible, and slavery was more horrible, but the early factories were places where you could expect to die in your mid-20s. It's not like it was a place where you worked till you were 65 and then got a pension and a clock. So I think it's these are things that's not, to some extent, not surprising that you get this identification. But and I'm cutting this down enormously in terms of details about these things, because I want to get something in about why this continues. Because the amazing thing, and I'd recommend reading Bury the Chains by Hochschild on this, is that this campaign won. It's like taking on the biggest, richest section of the ruling class and beating them in a period of campaigning over about 30 years or so. So then you get to a period when slave trade's gone away. So given my argument, which is that racism developed with the slave trade, out of the slave trade, don't we go back to the liberal argument that says, therefore it's not relevant anymore, therefore it's just a hangover of ideas from the past? And I think that it's very important to see that that's not true, because one thing that comes up is that racism is very useful. It's very useful to the ruling class because it's a way that people can be divided. You can divide people, you can set them against each other, you can say that they have different interests. Now, it was very useful in the time of on the slave trade. It remains very useful in the time of empire, certainly for Britain, when you can set up what David Hume was starting to hint at, the idea that rather than having blacks, they're horrible animals, and whites, we're good, you actually have a hierarchy. You have whites, we're good still, and blacks, well, that's not animals, but they're probably children. And in between you have Indians, Chinese, and all sorts of people that you can set up in order of how good they are or how smart they are, depending on who you're trading with and who you're invading at different times. And you build up an idea which unfortunately did catch on through with large sections of the British population, that there was a hierarchy of races and lots of other people were inferior. And since then you've seen this renewed with periods of immigration where it certainly makes sense to the ruling class to say these people are different, they're inferior, they're dirty, they eat funny food, or sometimes that they're not inherently different but their culture's different, which, as people will have seen in recent events, can very quickly go into they're pretty inherently different. Okay, the only thing really want to come on to is the idea of not so much why it is that the ruling class wants to divide us and set people against each other, because that's fairly obvious. They make money out of it, it helps them keep control. What's much more interesting really is the idea of why working class people actually go along with this sort of thing. And that is more difficult, because you sort of think, well, do working class people actually benefit from racism as it exists? And Marx said that he thought, I've got the quote here, he was talking about the Irish coming to industrial Britain and how in each city the priests, the press, the ruling class did everything they could to set Irish and English workers against each other, and that was the secret of their success. Because they, as long as workers saw other workers as being the problem, then that meant that the ruling class could get on with ruling. But he also said that the English workers were given an idea that they were part of the ruling elite, that actually they benefited, that they felt that there was something good about being English and the Irish didn't have it. And sometimes this was an idea that caught on, sometimes it was an idea that didn't catch on. I think it's very significant that the times when it caught on least were the times when workers were fighting together confidently and saying, we've got something together as workers, we don't need your ideas. So for instance, the first great working class movement in the world, the Chartist movement, the national leader of the Chartists, Fergus O'Connor, was Irish, of Irish descent, and incidentally the leader in London, William Cuffay, was black. So this shows how it's possible to go against the kind of mainstream ideas. But also, all these things become even more of an issue when you look at the United States. And looking at the period of the American South in the late 19th century, the great American Marxist writer W.E.B. Du Bois said, you've got to look at the situation with the with labourers in the American South, because he said the most amazing thing is there can't be two groups of people with more in common in the world, yet they hate each other. And he was saying that this is one of the great successes. I mean, you could say an awful lot about the period after the American Civil War, and most people don't know that there was a period called Radical Reconstruction when a lot of these people, black and white, came together amongst the as the poor, and it's a very underreported period and something that I recommend people find out about. But in order to break that unity, all sorts of methods of violence were used. This is when the Ku Klux Klan emerged as an organisation, and when all sorts of attempts were made to divide people up. And I've lost my place in the notes. I was going to quote what Du Bois said, because he talked about a psychological wage that is given to the white workers. And this is, here we are. the white group of labourers, while they receive a low wage, and this is the important thing, I think this is often misunderstood when people read this quote from Du Bois, the white workers, while they receive a low wage, were compensated for by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks and public schools, and he goes on at some length, whereas black people didn't have that. So this psychological wage made a lot of white people think that they were actually part of the ruling elite. But the point about it is it was a false wage, because actually, and there's been studies done on this, if you think if the whites in the South benefit from racism, then you would expect that in the most racist states in the American South, you would find that black workers got less than they did in less racist states, which was true, this happened, and that white workers got more because they would benefit. It's a seesaw where they go down, they go up. This wasn't true. There were several studies done in the 70s which actually looked at rates of pay around America, and what they discovered was that where black workers' pay was lowest, racism was highest, white workers' pay was also lowest, because it meant that you had a situation where white workers were spending their time thinking, well, I'm better than him, rather than thinking, why have I got such shit pay? And actually, where workers came together in the largely northern cities and so on, and were in the same unions and fought together, they both had better pay. And this is why I think there's a real problem with arguments that say that if one group of workers is better off, then they're kind of privileged in some way, and that means that their benefit has to be taken away in order to have some kind of equality. All this does is tend to level things down, whereas actually what the fight against racism can do, and people who stand up against racism, is level things up so that all workers finish together. And I've got to stop speaking, as I'm told, so I'm going to move into speaking in someone else's voice, which is, I've mentioned briefly the risings that happened in against the slave masters in the Caribbean. One of the reasons why the slave trade was wound down was it became dangerous, because you had large numbers of slaves who were in Caribbean islands, and they were very angry. Also, they heard about the French Revolution. Remember the first slide, talk about brotherhood, equality, and that all the planters would be sitting at their dinner table saying, we want some of that equality. It's terrible how in France they charge us enormous taxes, and we don't have any of this stuff. And a lot of the black people serving at tables thought, well, perhaps we want some of that equality as well. And in what's now Haiti, they rose up. They rose up and took over. They beat, it's another meeting, they won, I'll put it like this, they won under Toussaint Louverture, who was a slave who came to beat the best military minds of his day. It's another meeting. It probably isn't on this year, but it should be. And I hope they read it is on. The black. Right, I apologise to the speaker who is doing this meeting, so I didn't say no more. But I do want to finish with something that Toussaint said, which is he wrote a letter saying, "Yes, gentlemen." To the whites, we are free like you, and it is only by your avarice and your ignorance that anyone is still held in slavery up to this day. And we can neither see nor find the right that you pretend. We can neither see nor find the right that you pretend to have over us. We are your equals, then, by natural right, and if nature pleases itself to diversify colours within the human race, it is not a crime to be born black or an advantage to be born white. And I think that that's a statement we can still live by someone who is fighting back seriously against racism.
Jenny Sutton from Tottenham. The first is a comment, and I just wanted to make a comment about the fluidity of racism, because capitalism is really dynamic and will shift its targets in order to use racism for maximum divide and rule. So we've seen the Irish people, black people, but at the moment, if you see the stuff on TV about My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, treating traveller people in a way that David Attenborough might do an anthropological study of gorillas in the jungle. I mean, it's obvious that racism has different targets and is very, very fluid. But the other thing is a question, really. I was asked by black activists in Tottenham about what the SWP thought about the whole issue of reparations. And what they meant by that was, since British wealth has been built on the slave trade, shouldn't Britain give compensation to those countries from whom it plundered the slaves? And I couldn't give a really adequate response apart from to say, well, you can't really talk about Britain as a whole, you can talk about the British ruling class, but in terms of the recipients of that reparations, although at one level it looks like justice, actually it's hard to see how a mechanism would work without just enriching a layer of black bourgeois in those countries. But I didn't think that was quite a full or adequate response, and I'd quite like to hear how you would answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I had two questions. One, I agree with what you said, but I've heard this before, and I've always wondered how it is that black people in the Caribbean found out about things like the French Revolution in the detail that it inspired them, because I assume they couldn't read English because they weren't from England. And I don't, so I maybe overheard conversations and stuff like that, I don't know, I just wondered about that. And secondly, you said there was no racism before capitalism in Europe. My first thought when I was listening to that was about things like the Crusades and stuff like that. I know that was obviously religiously motivated and economically, politically motivated, but also anti-Semitism, which was rife in Europe to an extent.
My comment. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So I'll just reparations, really quickly. I think yes, we would be in favour of reparations if the British state decided but they were going to hand over hundreds of billions of pounds, which of course is not going to happen. But if they decided they were going to do that, we're for that. But obviously there has been an argument about who gets it, and I would say it would go to the people who were the descendants of the slaves. It's the majority of people say, for example, Jamaica, who live in absolute poverty while the ruling class sits on top of them saying that they're trying to fight the imperialists, or what I don't say that anymore, they used to. Yeah, it should go to those people. But how's that going to happen? Sort of a socialist revolution. That's the problem. So I remember when Bernie Grant started the campaign, we supported it. I mean, we ain't got a problem with that at all. Actually, it's quite a good, I'd say more as propaganda, because it's not going to happen, unfortunately, unless you have a revolutionary upsurge of black and white people in this country. But it's good for making an argument when they say to us that, black people are lazy, get out of our country, whatever it is, just remind people of actually the wealth of the slave trade is what built Western capitalism. Quite literally is what built half the cities of Britain. And we should remind people, remind the ruling class of that. So yeah, we support reparations and use it to actually have an argument about how capitalism started and actually how it was built in the interest of the rich and the powerful. And the people at the bottom in this country couldn't actually benefit from that unless you're being kidnapped and stuck on a ship for the British Navy. It should be Jonathan Neal's book about the British Navy. It's horrendous. Or but people benefited in the slums of London and Manchester, drinking dirty water and dying early. And so there was no benefit in that sense either.
Cormac, can you sum up?
Anti-Semitism, of course, existed. Was in medieval times there was anti-Semitism. There was cases in Lincoln or whatever where they attacked hundreds of Jewish people. Was it the same as biological racism that we're talking about? I don't think it was. It was based on a religious idea, but Jews were different religiously. It was possible to be converted. Actually, there was a lot of forced conversions. That's true as well, both by Spain. But you could convert to a Christian and not be persecuted. You can get out of it, you know what I mean? But yes, anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism clearly exists, the scientific racism that Ken was talking about. And how the slaves know about what was going on. Lastly, was because actually slaves played all sorts of roles on the plantation. So you had to have slaves who did all the hard grafting and so on, but also had other slaves who were in the house, had other slaves who looked after some of the machinery, and so on. So there's a variety of jobs. And Toussaint Louverture was a coachman, so he heard them speak, and understood French, obviously, because they had to relate.
Comrade, please.
That's how they heard it.
Thank you.
I think talking about slavery and racism. I was going to answer the anti-Semitism question, but also I was going to say it's about religion, and you can change your religion to get out of it. And I think that kind of answers the question. But another key point about racism is the revolts. There were big revolts in the 17th century against not just the slave system, but the indentured servitude system, where white workers, indentured slaves, and black slaves worked together, and it was really quite dangerous. There was one in Jamaica. There are other parts of the Caribbean, and the ruling class in Europe, the different European capitals, they lost control in certain situations. It was a very dangerous situation for them because it takes a long time to go over to the Caribbean in the 16th, 17th century. It takes a month, 2 months. You don't have like state control that you do now. You have like piracy. Why is there piracy? British Empire got going through piracy because it's quite difficult. The Spanish state found it difficult to control, and therefore they had to come up with something to control the population, including the white population. And one of those, the most important means of controlling people was using racism to justify what they were doing in this vile, miserable system of people coming over, and the millions of people that were brought over from Africa and exploited, and the destruction that is still the continuation of that today in Africa and around the world, and uneven development around the world continues today. But they needed racism to justify it. But they also needed racism to stop the dangerous situation of the white working class uniting with black people. And I also was going to say about how did slaves learn about these ideas of the French Revolution? Well, the abolitionist movement had a lot of dissenting Christians, and a lot of them went over to...
Can you sum up, please?
Yeah, a lot of them went over to the Caribbean, and they taught people religious texts, and through that slaves learned to read and write, and that was a very powerful and dangerous idea. If you learn about religious ideas, then maybe you might be free, and it starts to grow, and then you learn about the French Revolution. But I think loose attitudes is very, very important, because there's an idea that white rich people gave the slaves their freedom, and that's rubbish. They wanted to extend slavery, and it was the fight of black and white people who stopped it. So that's where we start and end. It's black and white people uniting against racism that can stop it. So,
Yeah.
Yes, I believe there is a myth that's been around for some time, and that is, even among the black people I spoke to in the West Indies and of course here, and it's that the slaves were freed by a guy called William Wilberforce some years ago. I think Paul Foote wrote an article refuting that. But most black people fail to realize that the slaves actually free themselves, because the only reason why I believe they agreed to free the slaves when they did, because of the revolution that was led by Toussaint, and there was lots of revolt in the colony at the time. People realized that they were about to free themselves, they agreed. Something else at work with you might care to comment on this is often not a black people I spoke to again who really totally believes that the white race didn't actually responsible for taking the slaves from the continent. They have said that the slaves were sold by other black people into slavery. I've told a lot of people that, when a group of soldiers came up with themselves guns and said, well, I want 100 or 200 slaves. What do you say? You've got pounds an hour. You can't actually say you're not going to provide these, the rule of England market. So, and that, I want to say one was it, which I actually draws between the slaves, which I want to bring to between the slaves freeing themselves and working class people today. I actually believe that working class people will have to free themselves from the yoke of capitalism. If we should wait for the ruling class to bring it about, it will never happen.
I'm Peter Manson from the CPGB and Weekly Worker. Thanks for that presentation. I found it very interesting, and I totally agree that racism began with the with capitalism, and specifically with the slave trade. But I've got a problem with this idea that racism is the main thing that they use to divide us. If that's the case, surely pre-capitalist ruling classes might have thought of that idea. So in that case, why wasn't there racism previously? It's true that racism has been used to divide us, and they still can do that, but they have other tricks up their sleeve. And what we see today, when I switch on the television today, what I don't see is a racist ideology from, the official ruling class. What I see is a national chauvinist ideology. An example of this struck me a couple of weeks ago when it was a black newsreader, and at the end of the news he said, "Later today, Andy Murray is playing at the Wimbledon final. We all hope he wins, don't we?" Okay, so that is a peculiar thing. I mean, that's supposed to be the news, but obviously it's what it is the kind of putting across national chauvinism. And today, whereas in the past you'd switch on the television and you read things like people in Africa are not ready for independence, and in South Africa perhaps we shouldn't give the blacks the vote just yet. I remember that as a young teenager in the early 60s. You won't see anything the equivalent of that today. Because today...
Can you sum up, please?
Yeah. The ruling class ideology is an anti-racist form of British chauvinism. And so, seeing racism everywhere, we're barking at the wrong tree. It's internationalism today that we've got to fight back against their national chauvinism.
Lady at the back.
Yeah.
No, lady at the back.
I'd actually like to come back on that a little bit, because I actually resent being told that racism is not a big thing in our society today, and that the ruling class is not pushing racism. If you look at the police, if you look at the amount of death custody, that is state racism. If you look at the difference between the number of black people who will stop and sit, black and Asian people, and white people who will stop and sit by the police, that is state racism. There's so much institutional racism, and at the moment we're seeing attacks on immigration from every mainstream party, and you're seeing the rise of UKIP and this right-wing populism attacking people. Now, are you saying that to be anti-immigrant is not to be racist? Because it is. Who are the immigrants that they're attacking? It's not the Americans, who are the biggest group of overstayers in the UK. It's the black people, it's the Eastern European, and we are absolutely seeing incredibly high levels of racism coming through in society today. And that's why I think that actually this meeting is particularly important. Because in order to understand how we fight back against that, you have to understand where it comes from and why it exists. And actually, it's very important that we take these arguments out there to people and say, we need black and white unity. White people aren't inherently racist. This isn't something that has always happened, and I think this is an incredibly important thing to take out, especially at a time when actually I do think the ruling class is trying to push racism as much as they possibly can.
I'm going to take two more speakers. All I can fit is two more speakers, I'm sorry. I'm going to take the woman in the middle and the man over there, okay? You're the last speaker, okay?
Yeah, just coming off of what's just been said, what came to my mind when this man was talking was when I'm watching the news, me and my children, and the fact that if someone black has done a crime, you will always see his picture, and you don't need to quiz over what colour he is. That is racism, and it's been normalised using those kind of methods. I work with teachers, I am a teacher, and recently a teacher that I work with, she's a Scottish lady, said to me that she gave her 4-year-old daughter at the beginning of the year a picture of the class that we work in, and she said, "Can you point and tell me which one is the bad boy?" And she picked the rather tall African lad, and she pointed. Now she's only 4 years old. Her mother was really upset that she had this response. She said she tried her again a year later and she did the same thing, and she can't understand why her daughter would do this, because she herself do not believe in such things. exterior? Can we still make there is a racism about where would a 4-year-old get this opinion from?
Right, you're going to be the last speaker, okay?
Yeah, just a quick question, and going back to the time of anti-Semitism, and the reason being given from the floor was because of religion. But how can racism against two other groups be explained? And I'm referring to travellers and Roma, who are European, who are white-skinned and are Christian. So I just wonder what's the explanation for that form of racism. Thanks.
Can you come back?
Okay. Right, well, I'll start with the thing about racism being the main thing that divides us. I don't particularly think racism is the main thing that divides us. Actually, I think in the world, class is the main thing that divides us. Racism is a serious thing that divides us, one of several. National chauvinism is another thing that's pushed, nationalism that's used in various ways by the ruling class. The ruling class, and particularly the British ruling class, you've had a lot of experience, are very skilled at using different forms of divide and rule to work against other people. And I think revolutionaries need to be enormously flexible on this subject, and certainly need to stick by ideas of internationalism. I think that's core, which is one of the reasons why we're in the international socialist tendency here. But the idea that racism is not a serious problem in Britain today, I mean, I think people have answered this. I find it a very strange idea to come up with. And as to the thing about if it would be an advantage to people before capitalism, why didn't they think of it before? I'm sorry, I didn't make it clear. I'm trying to say that there was actually a shift with the development of capitalism from a series of societies where there was no idea that people should be equal, so you didn't need such a justification for why they weren't being equal. And I think that's something that we need to constantly bear in mind. Would like to say something about races and the slavery and the uprising. I had to leave out the section I was hoping to talk about on slavery before capitalism, partly because it would talk about the existing slave trade in Africa, that there had been a slave trade in Africa and various people who were held in slavery before the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. There was partly a trans-Saharan slave trade. I want to just say a couple of things about this. One is to rush away from Africa back to England. When I forgot his name, the Conqueror, William the Conqueror, conquered England, he did a book called the Domesday Book, which, because this was his new property and he wanted to know what was in it. In the book he went to every village and wrote down who was what and what there was there. In that book, this isn't something I knew till quite recently, 10% of the population are marked down as slaves. And so this was a thing, it wasn't the dynamic that ran society at that point, but it was a serious factor in the way the society was run. In Africa, at the point, well, certainly in West Africa, at the point when the Portuguese arrived and started the slave trade, I think it's roughly the same. There were probably about 10% of the people were in slavery or in forced work of one sort or another. Now, I think that there's various things to say. Ideas of slavery varied. The fact that you could force someone to do something didn't necessarily mean that they had no rights or that they had no, for instance, lots of slaves had in various societies had property rights or so on. It also meant that even if you have a thing where people raid, take people away and sell them into slavery, which is part of what happened with some of the cross-Saharan trade, it doesn't necessarily mean that it destroys the societies that are already there. And I think that the shift that you start seeing with the Atlantic slave trade is a matter of scale. It just works on an enormously much bigger scale. And what that means is that the societies that existed in Africa, and I'm not how much to go into this, but one of the things about Africa is that it wasn't some sort of homogenous thing where everyone lived in the same way and all sorts of things. In some places there were empires, in some places there were what you might call semi-anarchist groups where there was no central authority. These different peoples, all with their own histories, had different ways of responding to the arrival of the European slave traders. But one of the things that the slave the traders did was say, we want slaves from inland, we're not prepared to go inland to get them, and we will help you. One of the manufactured goods that they brought was guns. So they were giving people guns to take it. It's not that no one had guns, because also some of the other people had guns because they were part of trans-Saharan trading networks and so on. But it meant that there was an enormous increase in the amount of violence. It meant that a lot of the best people who would have been running societies were taken away and sold into slavery. So I don't quite agree that it was like that there weren't Africans involved in the slave trade, but the slave trade that wrecked Africa, the people who were responsible for the destruction of Africa in its fact and setting it back, the underdevelopment of it, as people sometimes call it, were the capitalists who set up the slave trade. I mean, who got the slave trade going at an unimaginably higher level than it had been going before, and set up the triangular trade, which took I think over the period of the trade took something like 21 million people. They didn't all get to the Americas because a lot of people died on the way. Africa's whole population in that period was something like 50 million. You can imagine the kind of destruction to a society of having that many people moved away. So the responsibility is entirely with the capitalists, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think the question of reparations is quite important in that situation. Actually, no, I'll come back to it. I'll come back to it in a minute. Sorry, I'm trying to go through the notes to see if I can do things as quickly as possible. I won't come really any more on the revolutionaries. I obviously recommend people go to Christian's meeting to talk about their risings in the Haiti and so on, and Toussaint Louverture. I want to say something briefly about other ideas of oppression. That you had a whole series of oppressive societies, that the societies in pre-capitalist societies were often more oppressive. I was trying to emphasise this at the beginning. I'm not saying that they weren't fairly grim places to live a lot of the time, a lot of European feudal society, but that the kinds of prejudices that people had were often different. It was certainly the case that there was enormous prejudice against Jews, there was enormous prejudice against Muslims, but things were seen largely in terms of Christendom versus the heathen nations, and the Crusades were part of that. It's interesting, if you look at the casualties in the Crusades, that actually a lot of it was about fundamentally grabbing booty, and that if you had an army and you were charging across Asia Minor to get to the Holy Lands, and you found some rich-looking city there, it wasn't unusual to sack it, even though all the people there were Christians. And I think that this is something that sometimes when people talk about crusades as a noble venture, they leave out. But it is there is a thing about the ideas. Firstly, going back to the idea of racism as it developed, the idea that people can change is important. The idea that Jews could convert away from Judaism and therefore not be oppressed. But I don't think there's an absolute division that comes down, because if you see the kind of the people who are talking about the problems of Islam and Islamofascism and all that sort of thing today, a lot of the people that you will get talking about this are I've forgotten the name of the organisation of ex-Muslims. And these people who say, we're all right because we're no longer Muslim. The idea, and in Turkey, you have a situation where there's deep oppression of the Kurds, but Kurds who've said, I renounce my Kurdishness, I really am a Turk, have actually got to quite high positions. So there are differences in the kind of way that this different kinds of prejudice occur. But it's certainly the case that when there's an upping of the kind of levels of racism and some of the stuff that we've seen since the attack on Lee Rigby in Woolwich, sometimes the things drop away. So a lot of the people have been saying, oh, there's good Muslims and bad Muslims, and there's good ex-Muslims and so on. You start seeing a return to pure prejudice, because you actually see just an upping of everything, so that the idea that you can then say, no, it wasn't me, I've converted, I'm different, or I've given up Islam, and therefore can save yourself from attack, that doesn't really work. So actually you have to go back to saying, how is it that you fight the the racism that exists at the moment? How do you fight the things that cause the prejudice in the first place? And I think that that's not done by ignoring it, or as my friend David Goodhart in his British Dream does, denying the causes of this thing. The reason I'm picking on this book is because it's the sort of mainstream ideas of right-wing Labour, so it's not the classic racism of the Tories or UKIP or the fascists beyond that. This is another tradition of racism of right-wing Labour that I think is worth going on about. So I want to come back to the idea about the fluidity of racism. It is something that's enormously fluid, and it's something that the governments will try and do different things with. That they will try and say, oh, we're anti-racist, we're pro these people, we're against those people, in order to hold on to their own position. It's not the case that the primary thing that most governments want to do is pick on a particular group of people. The primary thing they want to do is keep in power. And if that involves picking on a particular group of people, then they'll do that. I mean, just as an aside on that, it's also the case that they're not actually sitting in some sort of James Bond thing, thinking about how evil they are and twirling their moustaches about some great plot against the working class and so on. Actually, I do think a lot of the time they do believe the nonsense that they come out with. It's not the case that they're actually above racism. I certainly have met people who consider themselves to be the sort of elites who actually have all sorts of weird prejudices in their ideas. So I think that I suppose that's the message that I want to come out. Well, the ruling class are our enemies. The only way that we can actually beat them is to come together. The examples I was trying to give of how you can challenge the ruling class, and how it's only through black and white coming together, and black and white, and perhaps oversimplifying, also means Gentile and Jew, Roma and non-Roma, whatever the things, that it's actually not allowing ourselves to be divided in the way that the ruling class is trying to do it, and seeing that workers need solidarity. It's not some sort of extra thing or just a slogan. It's just we can only win if we do that. But I do want to finish on a thing. Oh, and say before that, another little ad for the book, which goes through not just the stuff I've talked about the origins of racism. It also goes through various fightbacks that have gone on, whether in Britain, whether in America, the stuff about Islamophobia and certain arguments that are coming up today. But I want to finish with the thing about reparations, because I want to agree with what Gary said, that yes, we say we support them, because one of the things that is most important is that the British government likes to pretend that we never did anything wrong. The British government is incredibly innocent. And I think it's amazing that, considering the British government is the legacy government of the biggest empire the world's ever known, that it tries to sort of say, empire? What, us? No, we didn't do anything. And when you get this sort of idea that there might have been massacres or badness, there's a real feeling of shock. Now, personally, I've been following, going to the court for some of the case about the Mau Mau War. Now, the Mau Mau War, because it was a war against the British Empire that was fought by largely peasant Kenyans with very little outside support, has been largely written out of history. The British were able to say, oh, they were savage, they were barbarian, and they wanted unspeakable things. Don't know what it was about, it was unspeakable. And to actually have people now, veterans, who've been able to come back and say, we wanted independence, we fought for independence, and we were massacred and tortured for fighting for independence. And they had to come to the High Court in Britain, and the government actually saw it was going to lose and did a settlement out of court. Now, I think that this is enormously striking and enormously successful. Now, there's interesting things. For instance, when Kenya was granted independence in 1963, there's whole sections of the National Archive which disappeared. And the Kenyan government said, I don't know what happened to them, I think the British took them. The historian wrote to the British government and said, did you take them? They was, I don't think so. Then when it came to the High Court case, when the case was in court, in front of the British court, suddenly some bureaucrat said, oh, we seem to have them. And it turned out there's a bloody great archive by, is it in Buckinghamshire somewhere? They've got a warehouse full of things they nicked from various colonial powers, countries, when they granted them independence because they didn't want the natives to see them. And they're all still stored there. That now, because of this court case, because of these old Kenyans fighting back, you actually have a thing where some of the the racist stuff that came out from the empire is actually about to be revealed. It's still going to be redacted, but a lot of it is being made public. One of the reasons that the British government did not want a case about these reparations is that there were, I think it's 37 colonies there were notes from. Now, not all of them had quite such a brutal war as Kenya did, but a lot of places the British did stuff that they're very much ashamed of. And the very fact that they're still trying to cover up to this day, that the machinations they went through to try and not admit. First, they wouldn't admit that the Kenyans were tortured. Then they would say, well, perhaps they were tortured, but it probably wasn't by our guys. And then they would say, well, even if it was our guys that did it, actually, when you think about it, it's not our responsibility because we didn't know about it. I mean, a lot of these papers prove that they did know about it. And then, and to me, the sickest of the lot was, yeah, even if it was our responsibility, even if we were in charge, we handed over that authority, legal authority, to the Kenyan government when we granted them independence. So it's nothing to do with us. Now, I would like to see some Nazi war criminal or something try and use a defence like that. But there's the last one, of course, is that there is an argument about who does the money go to. And I think it's fascinating. The thing with the Kenya thing, why has it taken all this time before the victims of the torture during the Mau Mau War have come forward? Because they were illegal. The Mau Mau organisation was banned in Kenya. It was banned because the people, the ruling class who took over after independence, had not supported it and found it an embarrassment. They certainly weren't going to give all the land to the peasants who fought for it. So it was only all these decades later that people actually were made legal and were able to start fighting for their rights. So I think it does show why it's right that you need a wider social change, you need a wider socialist revolution that's actually going to get rid of these contradictions. But at no point should that mean that you let off the British state for its involvement in the development of racism and in perpetuating it.